Wednesday, 26th of July, 2023. On a quiet stretch of road in rural East Sussex, two vans were brought to a stop. Nothing about them stood out. What officers would uncover that day would take months to fully understand, and years to unravel. 3 months later, Wednesday, 4th of October 2023, a shipment of fruit arrived in the UK, crates stacked with clean paperwork. The kind of delivery that passed through ports every single day. By the time it reached a tire yard in Bradford, something hidden deep inside had already changed hands and triggered a chain of arrests that would stretch across the city. Then, in the early hours of Wednesday, the 27th of November 2024, across Warrington, officers moved quickly through the properties, seizing mobile phones, cash, and other items linked to the group. What they recovered was never meant to be seen outside that circle. Drugs, large sums of money, and a feud that was beginning to move closer to violence. At first glance, these moments had nothing to do with each other, but behind the scenes, they all followed the same pattern, until a single break exposed everything. This is the story of 3 major drug conspiracies, and how they were dismantled piece by piece. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. If we talk about the first story, the routes were not improvised. They were chosen because they looked ordinary. Movements that happened every day through ports that processed thousands of vehicles without pause. Nothing about the operation depended on speed or force, instead depended on being forgettable. One route relied on the motorhome crossing the North Sea from Rotterdam to Hull. The crossing itself raised no suspicion. It was used daily by tourists, tradespeople, and long-distance travelers. Inside the vehicle, however, compartments had been deliberately adapted. Black bin bags filled with ketamine were sealed away in spaces never meant to be opened, carried across the water without drawing attention. Once the ferry docked, the motorhome did not linger. It was driven inland, away from the port, before anything was unloaded. Reports suggested that it was a crucial part of the operation, and one that would soon draw attention to Russell King and the role he played behind the scenes. But we will talk about it in a few minutes. Running alongside that was a larger and more ambitious method. Commercial lorries entered the UK through Newhaven Port, arriving from mainland Europe with loads that appeared legitimate. Cardboard boxes were stacked, wrapped, and documented like any other delivery. To inspectors, they looked routine. However, inside they were anything but. Cocaine and ketamine were concealed to resemble standard freight, packed carefully for long journeys and designed to survive multiple handovers. Crucially, the drugs were never meant to stay on those vehicles for long. After arrival, the loads were moved quickly. Transfers took place at secluded rural locations, chosen for their isolation rather than convenience. Movements were kept short and controlled. Vans were used only long enough to receive the load, after which they were quickly moved on. The pattern was simple and repeatable. Nothing about the operation felt rushed, and that was the point. The planning relied on familiarity, with roads, with ports, with timing. And for a long time, it worked. Until one journey didn't. And the first crack appeared in a system far larger than anyone initially realized. Russell King did not sit at the edge of the operation. He sat near the center of it. To investigators, it quickly became clear that he was far more than a man moving drugs from one place to another. His role was logistical, organized, and sustained over time. At 63 years old, King did not fit the stereotype of a street-level dealer. He operated quietly, coordinating movements, timings, and handovers. Evidence showed he was trusted with large quantities of drugs and critical stages of the supply chain. When consignments moved, his involvement was rarely accidental. He knew each step exactly, like where they came from, who was transporting them, and where they were going next. In July 2023 alone, King was linked to the importation of 632 kilograms of ketamine into the UK. The scale of that single shipment placed him firmly in the upper tier of the operation. And that is not the end of his role. Reports confirm, just 1 month earlier, he had also been involved in bringing 70 kilograms of cannabis into the country, showing that the activity was ongoing and diversified rather than focused on a single load. By August 2024, his involvement had not slowed. Officers arrested King while he was unloading 100 kilograms of ketamine with an estimated street value of £2 million from his motorhome. It was not a transit stop or a contingency plan. It was the final stage of another planned delivery. Investigators also established that King traveled to mainland Europe to oversee preparation. He met directly with lorry drivers in France, where drugs were loaded into vehicles before crossing into the UK. His presence at that stage showed a level of authority and responsibility that went beyond simple transportation. Digital evidence reinforced that picture. Multiple chat threads recovered from his mobile phone were titled "Load, Load Tonight," and "Loading." These were not casual conversations. They pointed to repeated importations, coordinated schedules, and a system refined over time. The language, frequency, and structure of the messages made one thing clear. This was not a one-off offense, but part of a long-running operation. But King was not acting alone. The messages revealed another figure, operating at a distance whose influence stretched even further, and whose control did not stop at the prison gates. By the time Russell King was moving vehicles and overseeing loads on the continent, the overall direction of the operation was coming from somewhere far less visible. Arturas Jusas was not traveling, meeting drivers, or crossing borders. He was doing something far more difficult to detect. Jusas was operating from inside HMP Hyde Point in Suffolk, where he was already serving a 9-year and 9-month sentence for conspiring to traffic 69 illegal migrants into the UK by boat. Despite his imprisonment, investigators established that he remained actively involved in organizing large-scale drug importations from Europe. Using mobile phones, Jusas maintained contact with trusted associates on the outside. The messages showed him coordinating key elements of the operation rather than reacting to events as they happened. He gave instructions on how drugs should be packaged to blend in with legitimate freight, how vehicles should be loaded to avoid suspicion, and how movements should be timed to reduce the risk of detection at ports and border controls. He also went further than managing his own network. Evidence revealed that Jusas was offering a transportation service to other organized crime groups, effectively turning the route into a business model. For a fee, his network would move large quantities of cocaine and ketamine from mainland Europe into the UK, using methods already proven to work. Within the encrypted chat groups, Jusas did not dominate conversations. He was often silent, observing rather than speaking. But investigators identified him as the controller behind the scenes, the person with the authority to approve movements and resolve problems. His influence was understood without needing constant instruction. The scale of his involvement made one point unmistakable. Incarceration had not removed his control. It had merely changed how he exercised it. That arrangement would only come to light once a single journey failed, drawing attention to a network far larger than anyone initially suspected. The operation began to unravel on Wednesday, the 26th of July, 2023. On the A26 near Marsfield in East Sussex, officers stopped 2 vans travelling inland. At the time of the stop, there was nothing to suggest the scale of what was about to be uncovered. Inside the vehicles, officers found drugs concealed in a way designed to withstand long-distance transport. When the search was completed, the total haul amounted to 70 kilograms of cocaine and 632 kilograms of ketamine. The estimated street value of the seizure was £24.5 million, immediately marking it out as one of the most significant drug finds in the region. Further inquiries traced the shipment back to a lorry driven by Pavel Butsko, which had entered the UK earlier that day. The lorry had arrived via New Haven port, using the same route. Once off the ferry, the load was not taken directly to a warehouse or distribution centre. Instead, it was moved quickly to a nearby location, where the drugs were transferred into the two vans that were later stopped on the A26. The speed of the offload was deliberate. The aim was to distance the original vehicle from the drugs as soon as possible, reducing the risk that a single interception could expose the wider route. But this time, the timing failed. Intelligence had already been developed, and officers were in position before the vans could move further inland. The scale of the seizure led Sussex police to describe it as the largest drug seizure ever made in the county. What initially appeared to be a routine vehicle stop had, in a matter of hours, exposed an operation responsible for moving hundreds of kilograms of drugs into the UK. And as investigators began to examine how the vans had reached that road, the focus quickly shifted away from the drivers and towards the communication networks that had made the journey possible. What investigators recovered from those seized devices proved just as significant as the drugs themselves. At the center of the communications was a private WhatsApp group titled Unload One. Analysis showed it had been created specifically for the importation that took place on the 26th of July 2023. It was not a general chat or a long-running group,